Well, yeah.
So
If you
I
want to
want to I
start,
want to start this conversation
yeah.
just on the basis of what would your recommendations be for the management of wildlife?
Yeah, so I take a non-interventionist approach. So I think the best ways to quote unquote manage wildlife is to work with natural processes. For issues of overpopulation or invasive species, I think there are ethical approaches, to managing these things. If we look at carrying capacity, right, and land use being a big driver of carrying capacity through various means, either for the benefit or the detriment of the capacity of a species. And on the more extreme side, right, where I think in a lot of cases you would argue like hunting is a tool for managing population, I would argue that,
Hmm.
we as a society are moving towards more ethical approaches to animal management. And I think that a more ethical approach that more people are going to be interested in as, the technology continues to improve, like we've seen over the last few decades, is sterilization methods as well as humane capture and release into like sanctuary areas in the case of like wild hogs or other animals
Hmm.
that have negative benefit or negative impacts on ecosystems or in crop areas. And I think a lot of the expenses we see with the technological growth that's happening are going to continue to decrease. So a lot of these methods that seem unfeasible right now, as far as financial approaches to things like sterilization through feed or capture and
Yeah,
release would be, more and more feasible as we move forward.
yeah. So let's hit on a few things you just said there. Number one, we can hit on the use of contraceptives. Now, I am all for contraceptive use whenever it is beneficial. An example of this would be in highly urbanized areas for feral cats, for even white-tailed deer. There's a Canadian company, Spayvac, that is currently spearheading a contraceptive for white-tailed deer. I actually
Yeah,
have pulled up the National Library of Medicine, the effectiveness of Spayvac for reducing white-tailed deer fertility. So this is a peer-reviewed study that Spayvac did in partnership with the National Library of Medicine. And so through this study, what they found was that when they implement Spayvac, what they're doing is they're eliminating a generation from that population, which makes them more susceptible to diseases. So when it comes to sterilization, no matter how we sterilize, if we're going to lose that generation, then what we're doing is we're opening the door for diseases like chronic wasting disease and EHD to have more of a foothold in that population. Another example of this is the Parker's Island white-tailed deer herd, where they were doing contraceptive management because of a lack of a natural predator, and they ended up having to introduce a hunt on that island to help control the population of white-tailed deer because even through using contraceptives at a limited rate, they were still dealing with overpopulation, overbrowsing, which opened the door to disease.
yeah. So I did share a huge document with you. I know with like
Yeah,
40 different sources. Some were quoting success stories with contraceptives and remote sterilization options. So we do have evidence that it can help. And like you mentioned, there
yes.
are specific applications in like urban areas where maybe predator reintroductions just don't really make sense for human conflict. So I would advocate for the use of contraceptives in those situations where you also
Yeah.
can't really approach, maybe the land use issues involved with carrying capacity. So I think that is a more humane option. Also, in the document that I sent you is, I believe, at least one or probably about 3 or 4 studies on chronic wasting disease. One
Yes.
points to various means, where hunting activities can actually increase the spread of chronic wasting disease. A lot of times it's through, improper management of the bodies, carrying
Hmm.
across the line, things like that, which I know you would say, well, a good hunter should know better for sure. But the fact
Yeah.
is that hunters maybe are not as educated as you on some of these subjects. And I think that that still runs a risk for perpetuating these diseases.
So
It also encourages us, if we're taking the approach where we're encouraging hunters to try to tackle these things like chronic wasting disease, which are, kind of emerging pathogens
mhm,
for animals, it does put us in closer contact with these animals. So advocating for
mhm,
that versus the reintroduction of, say, predators, who we do have studies like I sourced, in the document that I sent you,
yeah.
showing that the predators actually handle and decrease the rate of the spread of CWD and other like there's another foot related disease that have some studies showing that predators, can reduce those rates as
Foot
well.
rot, yes.
A lot more effective than humans. So I think, it's a lot better to take those non-interventionist approaches where we're not getting humans involved. We don't have to worry about the education, of humans on how to handle
Hmm.
these diseases and, take proper biological control mechanisms like should be,
Yeah.
happening in these areas. And also we know that, I think I've heard you say on one of your lives, like CWD isn't really a big issue in a lot of the areas, right? Like it is an emergent
Well,
issue, but
now
most of those issues are
CWD is a big issue in over 40 states now. So
okay.
it is it's an issue that we're having to tackle.
Sure,
And everything you just said, there's two main things I want to hit on. That is hunters spreading CWD. And in states where CWD is an issue, so here in Kentucky, for example, CWD was just detected 2 years ago. Now, if you're in a CWD zone in Kentucky, so an area where it is prevalent, if you harvest a white-tailed deer in that zone, you are required by law to take
right,
that deer right off the bat to a check station so they can check it. Because chronic wasting disease can only be detected post-mortem. So part of the way that we track the spread of the disease is through hunters because hunters are able to bring their deer to these check stations. Wisconsin has a program going on right now for CWD detection, specifically with doe white-tailed deer. It's a late season hunt for CWD detection. But the other thing is, you mentioned the non-interventionist approach. I talk a lot about Yellowstone National Park because I think Yellowstone is a great example of having an area of non-intervention and letting nature take its course because there's no hunting allowed in the park, no culls happen inside the park boundaries. It is truly like as wild as one could hope. But the problem is just because inside the park boundaries there's no hunting that's non-interventionist doesn't mean that those populations still aren't managed by hunting.
right.
The bison, for example, the bison herd is managed through a few hunts. There's the West Yellowstone and also the Gardner hunt. And these are done to control the population. Now, when we're talking about habitat usage and we're talking about just, habitat in general, I think if we lived in a North America that did not have sprawling cities and interstate highways and roads and communities that have been built, that we would not, have a necessity to hunt. But the
I
fact of the
agree.
matter is we do. And
I,
there is
I,
the
so,
agricultural
so
side of it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just want to say, because you've made kind of quite a few claims and you're getting into kind of a new topic. So you mentioned that CWD can't be tested except in biopsies, like post-mortem. That's not
Yes,
true.
brainstem.
So that is the easiest way to test because the brainstem and central nervous system is where the prions aggregate. So for
Hmm.
testing post-mortem, yeah, that is the best way. But you actually can do blood testing. You can also do feces and urine testing. You can do tonsils. Like there's tons of different ways to do this in even live deer.
So,
And we can
so
actually
as
detect it
I'll
pretty
say this,
early.
as someone who has worked for Fish and Wildlife at chronic wasting disease check stations and testing in Arkansas specifically CWD in captive white-tailed deer, which I don't agree with just right off the bat. But anyways, through USDA and through Fish and Wildlife, the only acceptable way that they will take a CWD test, so legality wise, the only acceptable way they will take a CWD test is post-mortem because the methods
Well,
that
I
you're talking.
understand, but Ethan, like you did make a claim. You said that it was
Yes, yes,
only
yes.
able to be tested
Well,
after. I'm just like saying like that's not
yeah.
true.
The
If
reason
we
why
had,
the reason why
if,
we only
not,
test after.
but
So
the
Ben,
reason
what
I
I'll
want
say is
to
the reason we only test after is because it is not a viable test to do it through fecal material or tonsils because the effectiveness of that test is not 100%. Deer
I
can give
disagree.
deer can give false positives and deer can also give false negatives when you're doing those tests. An example of this is a white-tailed deer farm in Kansas that was specifically raising CWD resistant deer.
Okay. The only reason I point this out though, Ethan, is because you did make a claim that it wasn't possible. It is possible, and that helps my position of like hunting isn't necessary in these situations, and it actually contributes to issues. You're trying to make the argument that we can help with CWD by hunting, which I already mentioned. That we have evidence that hunting,
Mhm.
especially practice hunting, can have negative impacts as far as decreasing the spread. It can perpetuate the spread of prions, in the ecosystem more so than predators could.
Yeah.
So if we can do testing in ulterior ways, we don't necessarily have to rely on hunting as a means of testing. The reason that hunting is the means of testing is because hunters are coming in the most contact with deer with the potential for CWD, right? So
So
we're already seeing, I just want to mention that we've already seen, a decrease in the hunting population. Like since 1980, we've had a
mhm.
50% decline in the registered hunters. So the more we try to rely on the hunting population for gathering data about the ecosystem and ecology, the less data we're going to have, right, over time,
So
because we continue to
you've
see.
made a wonderful point about chronic wasting disease and also the rise of chronic wasting disease. The argument you're claiming is that hunters are they're a vector for the spread of chronic wasting disease because of the movement of white-tailed deer post-mortem. What I would say is, and hopefully you said you're well researched on chronic wasting disease, so you know where it came from. It came from the Rocky Mountains. You know that the reason that chronic wasting disease spread in general is because of a lack of hunting pressure on white-tailed deer and mule deer and other ungulate populations. Because of the
So
lack of, so let's get through this. So because of a lack of hunting pressure during the 1960s and 70s, during the rebuilding stage for these populations, because white-tailed deer were extirpated in much of their native range, what occurred was a boom in population. This is also partially because of a boom in agriculture in the Midwest. It provided more nutrients for the population to grow.
I agree.
Because this population uh, became overpopulated, herds that historically did not mingle with one another began mingling. And we're seeing mixtures of mule deer and white-tailed deer and elk in North America that historically did not occur. This is how chronic wasting disease made it spread across North America. So when you're saying that hunters are the main vector for chronic wasting disease, or one of the vectors for chronic wasting disease, what I would say is that the real reason chronic wasting disease spread is because of overpopulation, because we didn't take an approach to managing that population that was hands on enough. And because of that, that's the situation we have ourselves in now.
Okay, I mean, I agree with you that it's overpopulation more so than an issue that hunters are introducing, but hunters do have a impact on this, and it is
Yes,
actually
yes,
helping
yes,
to
yes,
increase.
yes.
It's helping
Yes,
to increase the spread.
but,
Ethan, if I can make my
well,
point
well,
though,
I
because
want to prevent you
we're
from talking
talking.
yourself in a circle here because I don't want to spend our hour
Well,
talking
yeah,
about CWD.
you also
So,
made a
Ben,
claim that
so Ben,
overpopulation.
when you're, I just want to, this is as clear as I can make it. You're saying that hunters have an effect on the spread, but at the same time, if we did not hunt, you acknowledge that the lack of hunting, which results in overpopulation, means it spreads more because
So,
that's
so
how we got in this issue in
this
the
is
first place.
a little dishonest because you did come into the discussion around CWD here when we're kind of reforming this argument, and you mentioned that it's the lack of hunting, right?
Yes.
In reality, it's a lack of predation, right? Like we
Hmm.
don't have the same predator to prey ratio as pre-colonization, right?
This is true.
Because of hunting and over extirpation of these predator animals like the red wolves in the east, like
Yeah.
wolves in the west, even coyote hunting, bear hunting, like all of these things have an impact on the predator to prey ratio, right? So
Yes.
from my perspective as a non-interventionist conservationist, I look at it and I say, well, hunting has contributed to the lack of predator to prey ratio, right? The lack of
Hmm.
proper predators in the environment. We also have pressure that hunters are exerting on the prey population as well as the predator populations, right? Which that impacts the ecosystem. And like you mentioned, we also have changing land use, right? Which is
Yes.
changing carrying capacity. These are all things I would look at before saying, okay, I need to go in and I need to unalive animals, right? So
So
as somebody who cares
perfect.
about ethics, right, and the individuals, right, like I really want to get into the ethics with you because I think that's an area where like you like to focus on these ideas like chronic wasting disease,
Hmm.
and these altruistic ways of hunting, right? And I would argue that's not really the majority of people. Like, right, most people, like, and even me growing up hunting, like, we did it for a sport, man. Like, yes, you get that freezer full,
Hmm.
at the end of the year, but you're going out to enjoy nature. You're going out to, partake in a cultural or tradition activity, right? It's not
Hmm.
about trying to help, reduce. And I appreciate that I heard you, speaking with Ozark, and you mentioned that if you had one tag left, you would take the CWD deer. And I think you
Oh
biting
yeah.
that bullet, I can appreciate that, right? Because you're trying to be consistent in applying, your altruistic stance in conservation and in hunting. But from my perspective, there are other options, right? Like we talked about sterilization, we talked about carrying capacity, we talked about predators. there's so many different aspects that we can approach in an ethical stance, right?
Hmm.
If we care about these individuals, as deer, within their herd and within their larger ecosystem, I think we should be taking the ethical approach, not just the approach that, looks at what we can take from these animals or these ecosystems. So are you willing to like get into like some hypotheticals about, the difference in why we treat, chronic wasting disease in deer differently than we treat like, issues in dogs and cats?
So I do, but before we get into hypotheticals, you mentioned predation and a lack
Okay.
of predation,
Yeah.
and that's my bread and butter. So that's what I want to talk about, and we'll circle back to Yellowstone. So
Okay.
as I mentioned, Yellowstone, the prey animals in Yellowstone, so bison, Rocky Mountain elk, pronghorn, mule deer, and white-tailed deer in the Wyoming portion. Those animals are not hunted inside the park. But outside of park boundaries, hunts still persist for animals that do spend most of their time or even their youth in Yellowstone. Now, I think you could agree with me, and judging off Fish and Wildlife statistics, that predators in Yellowstone have been completely recovered. The grizzly bear in Yellowstone, whenever Fish and Wildlife said about the grizzly bear reintroduction, the recovered capacity for grizzlies in Yellowstone was set at 250. There are now over 1,250 individuals in Yellowstone. As well for wolves, the recovered capacity for wolves was 70 individuals, and now they're estimated at 110. So for ecologists, the predation metrics in Yellowstone are being met, but we're still having to hunt the prey animals in Yellowstone, even with a untouched ecosystem with predators in it, because the
One.
predators can't keep up.
Okay.
Huh? Yeah, the
So
predators can't keep
you're
up.
saying that even with a healthy, like from an ecological perspective, even with the healthy predator to prey dynamic, we're not seeing the changes in the prey populations that you would expect with this ratio.
Yes, and the reason for this is because outside of the wilderness of the park, there are grasslands where both animal and crop agriculture are taking place. This is going to continue to persist no matter what we do, whether it's crop agriculture and a vegan diet, or whether it's animal agriculture in our current system, and both. The problem with this is the increase in nutrients means these animals can wander outside of the park and allows them to persist and conceive more young in a way that is not feasible for the predator population to keep up with. And this isn't an ecosystem with the predator, threshold being met. So the problem we run into in areas outside of Yellowstone, so here in Kentucky or Wisconsin or Kansas, is that we do have a lack of predators, even through predator reintroductions taking place. We do have a lack of predators on the landscape, and they can't keep up because of the increase in nutrient yield in the environment that these prey animals are experiencing. It is a land use problem.
Yeah.
And it really comes down to a land use problem because the predators do not want to be in close contact with human beings. And we don't want predators in close contact with us, even from a non livestock standpoint. If you
Yeah.
look at, Los Angeles, California, they drive mountain lions out of Los Angeles quite often because they don't want them in close quarters with humans.
Yeah.
So when it comes to the management of our prey species in the environment, we can no longer solely rely on predators to do the brunt of the work. And even whenever we do not solely rely on predators and implement multiple strategies, such as SPAVAC in the study I mentioned, in urban areas, the coyote population has increased tenfold from what it was even 40 years ago. And 90% of a coyote's diet is made up of fawns. And we're still having to implement hunting, SPAVAC, and relying on coyotes to manage that population because of the increase in nutrient yield.
But I think we've already touched on the core issue, right? And what contributes to these like large populations, and it's carrying capacity, right? So if
Hmm.
we start at carrying capacity and then predator ratio is our second, step. Where if we start at the carrying capacity, we can understand, we can look outside of just Yellowstone, right? And the
Yeah,
larger area, the migration areas, we can create wildlife corridors. If we properly design and protect farms, we can prevent wildlife from getting into farm areas and agricultural fields. It's not just high fencing. We can create
yeah,
hedgerows
yeah,
and natural, barriers for very cheaply. We do that on our farm. We also
yeah,
have wildlife corridors, to direct coyotes away from our farm, like through our farm, but not too close to our animals, that could be predated on.
yeah.
So there are other options, right? And I
But
think that by taking an ethical approach to it, we should be looking firstly at the land use practices that are
Ben,
contributing
before we
to
move
the.
on from that, you say there are other options.
Yeah.
So my question would be then, we're talking about carrying capacity and having, an overpopulation from a scientific term, an overpopulation of animals on the landscape.
Yeah.
You mentioned, having wildlife corridors and, making space for these animals. Would that not then contribute to the spread of disease problem that we're currently experiencing in white-tailed deer populations and elk populations and other ungulate species here in the United States?
Well, I think a lot of the disease pressure, like we see with viruses, like we're seeing with the bird flu. Hopefully, I
Hmm.
don't get fined for saying that, but like we see with viruses, like we see with CWD and other like zoonotical diseases. A lot of these pressures come from human encroachment into areas, right? And I
Hmm.
definitely want to touch on land use. So if we are focused on creating healthy habitat and ecosystems for animals and proper wildlife corridors to allow animals to have extended migration space, I think we can have healthier ecosystems than we currently have. A lot of that does involve, like stepping back and kind of managing hunting a lot differently than we currently do in some of our wild spaces. And being more considerate of the overall ecosystem. But if we talk about conservation, I think the most important thing, which we've touched on many different times, is land use, right? And
Agreed.
so as a conservationist, if we're going and we're contributing to systems that perpetuate poor land management and poor land use, we are doing the opposite of what you and I are wanting to do as far as protecting and preserving nature, right? So
Hmm.
the best thing we can do for conservation is to adopt a plant-based diet. 80% of global farmland goes towards feeding animals, right? And those
So,
animals, those 92 billion animals that are eating 80% of the crop that we grow, only
mhm.
contribute 20% of global calories, actually less than 20% of global
So
calories. That's
yeah. So let's
extremely
let's talk
inefficient.
about
So,
land
so
use.
if we actually care about conservation and protecting
Hmm.
wildlife, we need to be looking at how we in a daily way are contributing, right? So would you
Yes.
agree that true conservationists should be on a plant-based diet?
So here's what I would say, Ben. I would say part of the issue with overpopulation is an increase in nutrients. Now, when it comes to crop-based agriculture versus animal-based agriculture, and I'm not talking about a factory farming standpoint, I'm talking about a Western sense of range flocking and large fenced-in pastures and BLM land. The difference is, whenever we're doing crop farming in these instances, what we're doing is we're introducing a new type of forage for these native species that is high in energy, high in carbs, and it allows them to perpetuate their population more, therefore increasing the carrying capacity and contributing more to overpopulation. Now, if you look at what the Bureau of Land Management does with their lease lands, they do them in 10-year leases where you can go and graze it for 10 years, and then it's put in a 10-year conservation lease. What this does is it keeps the land as natural as it can be, while also allowing leasing to come in with people who are doing range flock of sheep and cattle. So, what I would say, Ben, is as a vegan, what steps would you take to prevent overpopulation from occurring when you're introducing a new feed source into, let's say, white-tailed deer?
So Ethan, this is like I wonder, can you tell me back like my argument for why a conservationist should be plant-based? Can you explain to me like that like understanding of my argument that I presented?
So, Ben, the main thing I got from your argument was you say plant-based diet. You agree we'll have to grow more plants for a vegan diet.
Okay,
You don't
well,
believe so?
so you just stated that you didn't hear anything I said. So let
No,
me
I
let me
did.
state my
I want to
position.
keep the conversation going.
Let me
So,
restate my
go
position
ahead.
on why I think a conservationist, if you care about land use,
Hmm.
should be plant-based, right? If we want to
Go ahead.
maximize, our potential for preserving land and
Hmm.
stopping the spread of agriculture, the best thing we can do is eat plants. Again, 80% of agriculture land globally is for feeding animals that we then
Hmm.
consume for a decrease in calories, right? So we are losing massive amounts of our cropland to feeding animals, right? So when you purchase an animal product, you are
Yeah,
incentivizing more animal products to be created, and that requires feed, that requires water. One hamburger takes over 600 gallons of water, right?
I
So if we
understand.
want
Yeah.
to, if we want to preserve natural resources, the first thing that we should all be doing is looking at what we are consuming on a daily basis. So, do you understand now why we would
I
act?
understand. I understand the point of the argument.
So,
I do.
and do you understand why a vegan diet, if everybody went vegan, if everybody was eating a plant-based diet, we would require less farmland? Do you understand that
I
position?
understand the point you're making. So my
Okay.
question would be then, and I'll look at a specific example. I've done conservation work in Michigan now for 3 years. Michigan currently has, agricultural fields of both crops and also livestock. Michigan currently is dealing with the worst deer overpopulation out of any state in the United States. To the point to where if you go and get a crop damage tag, they're allowing you to, with that tag, unalive up to 70 deer because of the overpopulation that is already presented by the crops they are currently growing. And through your argument, I understand you would say we would be growing less crops, but we would still be dealing with an overpopulation. It may slow it, but we'd still be dealing with overpopulation because they're still going to have a feed source that is unnatural because we would still be growing crops. So
So,
even with a even with a yes, even with a decrease in the rate of overpopulation, uh, we know that contraceptive management would not work because of that lack of a generational spread and because we're facing the spread of disease. And we know that predator management through the Yellowstone example can only do so much. So my question would then be, what other way could we manage these populations to deal with overpopulation?
yeah, so like I've mentioned before, in the previous two arguments that I made for overpopulation issues, the biggest thing is carrying capacity. So like I
Yes.
mentioned, we can reduce our agricultural land use by just all shifting to a plant-based diet. We can also change the carrying capacity for wild animals by adequately protecting crops, right? Through fencing, through
Hmm.
electric fencing could be actually very cheap. For doing solar electric fencing, that's what we use to protect some of our sensitive crops here on our
Yeah.
farm. We also have wildlife corridors as well as hedgerows, that are too thick for most animals to get through. That would be like herbivores, like large deer. So there's various means of further reducing the carrying capacity and the integration between like wild areas and agricultural areas. So, again, that would be the first place I would start. The
Yeah.
second place, would be sterilization because, like I mentioned from the spreadsheet I sent you or from the document I sent you, there are examples of sterilization helping, with these issues. If you're worried about genetics, I think we also should be looking at the genetic impact of hunting, right? Like through trophy hunting, a lot of people going out to get that biggest buck or the biggest doe, that does
So
have an
yeah, yeah,
impact
yeah,
on
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
genetics.
We can, if you want to talk about trophy hunting, do you have any sources about the genetic impact of trophy hunting?
Yeah, so there was one on the document that I sent you. I can pull it back up here. But
Yeah.
there is one study, I believe, on the genetic impact of hunting, of regulated hunting. Let's see.
I think I have that one pulled up here.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, obviously that has like just logically thinking about it, right? Like if most people are going out and they're not like you, an altruistic hunter, that's trying to go after that sickly deer. They want to fill their freezer, right? So
Hmm.
most likely, a hunter in that position is going to go after the larger buck. I do understand that, through regulations and hunting seasons, we're trying to allow that buck to reproduce. But in the grand scheme of it, right, if every year most hunters are going after a bigger buck, there's going to be a reduction in those genetics leading to larger bucks, right? So that's just
So,
basic common sense, right?
so let's, again, as someone who's worked in ungulate management for fish and wildlife, that's not true. Every statistic that we have, at least here in the state of Kentucky and Michigan, is that through removing a mature white-tailed deer from an ecosystem, what that does is it creates a vacuum effect. The same thing that occurs whenever people coyote hunt. It creates a
Yeah.
vacuum effect in the ecosystem. So what this does is it creates a genetic void in that ecosystem that another deer can move into and challenge for that spot, therefore spreading genetics. And this is extremely important right now because that also helps build a resistance to the spread of disease. So when we're talking about antler genetics, I'm going to be honest with you, I could care less. When we're talking about disease genetics, which is what I'm focused on, being able to go out in an ecosystem and, by your definition, trophy hunt for a big mature white-tailed deer, that might have a negative impact in the long run on antler size. But I don't think you and I either care about antler size. We care about the health of the population. And every study we have shows that that's a beneficial thing for the population in general.
No, so the study that I've cited, it's called Demographic Side Effects of Selective Hunting in Ungulates and Carnivores. does show that issues with sex ratio when we are hunting larger bucks, preferentially, issues from reproductive rates from that, also social structure issues that happen with inside of the herds. Obviously, for somebody like myself who learned to care about these wild animals, I'm thinking
Mhm.
about the fact that taking that one doe has on her children or on the rest of the herd that relied on her, as well as overall population stability is also impacted. So hunting, we do have plenty of evidence, and some from the sources which I presented you, to show that hunting, even regulated hunting, in the best case of hunting, actually disrupts these ecosystems more so than it helps. And again, just thinking logically about it, if a deer can live 20 to 30 years, right, and continue to spread on its genetics, and the healthiest animals through natural selection would be spreading on their genetics, even if you introduce just a few hunters that are going out and they want a larger buck or they want a larger doe, that is having a direct impact on the genetic pool that is available in that ecosystem, right? So there's no way that you can argue, that it has a benefit when it's literally removing genes out of the situation. I do agree that competition is reduced, through the taking of certain animals, like we see in coyotes. You can almost unalive as many as you want, and they're going to reproduce and
Mhm.
rebound that next, through natural kind of processes and through carrying capacity, and the competition, that's happening and being decreased through hunting. So that allows for a rebound. But the fact is that if we're focused on genetics and healthy animals in the long term, we need to be considering that taking, any sort of animal genetics out, especially, somebody like yourself, if you're focused on taking the CWD animals out or the unhealthy animals, most people are not like that, right? Like most people are
Mhm.
out hunting for enjoyment. They want to take a cool picture, with their bloody animal, to post on social media. So like I don't think that the argument holds any water if you're trying to say that hunting can help these, ecosystems, or much less even, these species that we're hunting.
So I've got the article pulled up right now,
Okay.
reading it. The article is based out of Mexico. It's a University of Mexico who did the study. So first off, that raises a red flag for me because whenever I talk about my argument, I talk about it from the North American model of wildlife conservation.
So
And this is,
Mexico is in North America, though.
yes, I understand that, but the North American model of wildlife
And
conservation, which
so
is followed by Fish and
Mexico,
Wildlife, is only
but
adopted by the United States and Canada.
okay, so well, I'm glad you mentioned Canada, because yes, that is technically true. But I believe we do have migratory bird, agreements with Mexico, as well as some in
This
Central
is
America as
true,
well.
but this is through the Migratory Bird Protection Act, and this does not fall into wildlife conservation practices that the United States and Canada implement in reference to Mexico. A reason for this is Mexico does not base their hunting seasons off the United States as where Canada does. So there's
Okay.
direct partnership between the organizations in the United States and Canada, but for Mexico, there's not a direct partnership as seen. The only place we see that direct partnership is through migratory species such as waterfowl.
Okay, I mean that's fair enough, but I don't think that devalues the study.
So
I didn't really
again,
hear like a
talking well,
conclusive
let's
lie.
get into what the study says. I have it pulled up here. Talking about removing a large proportion of specific age or sex class and the harvesting strategies, which may delay birth rates, reduce birth synchrony, delay body mass development. Everything it mentions in the study. So I refer back to Michigan, who again is having the biggest problem with deer overpopulation here in the United States. If you look up the ratio of does to bucks killed in Michigan, the ratio is 10-1 in favor of does currently. We're removing a large number of females because of overpopulation. This is not, a trophy hunting instance. This is a population control instance, which is my bread and butter of hunting. So when we're talking about removing specific individuals, when it comes to a buck, uh, across all the United States, unless you're in a state which has an incredibly high deer mass, you're allowed one antler deer per season. The number of hunters that hunt in the state of Kentucky that harvest deer is about 15,000 individuals. Our whitetail deer population is over 1 million. So when we're seeing a negative genetic effect, as seen in this study, uh, you have to buy to see the full literature. See the full literature. It costs $12 for 48-hour online access. But I would like to see the parameters of which this study was based. I know Mexico, the way that they manage their game farms, is if you want to hunt in Mexico, you have to go to someone's private ranch and they manage it specifically for hunting. They don't have public land opportunities like we do here in the United States. If you're managing a game ranch as such, then this study would be 110% applicable. But when we're talking about wild deer genetics, this is not what we see. An example of this is in Michigan currently, where Michigan has an overpopulation of does, and we're taking out does, but we're not seeing a decrease in the birth rate. We're not seeing a mismatch of sexes through the targeting of does. Through this study, the targeting of bucks could be seen, but not on a macro scale, more on a micro scale, which, assuming it's a Mexican game ranch where this was studied at, is possible.
Okay. No, I can appreciate all of that. And yeah, I mean, it's worth looking into other studies for sure. But I did hear something, that you mentioned about your state in specific, that does kind of contradict the point that, hunting should be considered conservation for
Mm-hmm.
purposes of population control. Like I mentioned, we've had a 50% decrease in the amount of registered hunters since the 1980s. Here in the
Yes.
United States. We've also seen this trend in other developed nations like Canada, maybe not to the same degree. And of course, the populations, ebb and flow, just like in nature. Nothing is static, right? It's not just a straight
Yes.
up down line. So if we continue to see this trend that's been happening for about 4 decades, we can fairly confidently say that there are going to be less and less hunters in the future. If you're trying to
Agree.
rely on population control of millions of animals across the US for a small subset of the population willing to go out and unalive those animals violently, you come to a problem, right? You've got to figure out how to get all of these individuals who are willing to go out and be violent against wildlife, to go out and do it to a certain level, right, to what you're talking about. So not
Mm.
only is that
Yeah.
unrealistic, it's also just not going to happen. So that is why that hunting should not be considered conservation, because it's not an adequate approach to the problem that we currently have, right? We need to approach
So
this with
here's my
technology.
question. I have two questions. I've got two questions. One, when we're talking about sterilization, it is not an adequate, management tool that we currently have. Would you consider sterilization of wildlife conservation?
Why?
But why is it not? Because through the study that I have pulled up from Spavak, let me pull it back up so I can quote it correctly. Uh, the National Library of Medicine, effectiveness of Spavak for reducing white-tailed deer fertility. What we know is that it can work in highly urbanized areas, but on a broad scale, it does not have an impact on the population uh, rate. And it also can make them more susceptible to disease because of that skip in generation. So, would you consider
I
that wildlife
definitely
conservation?
So I definitely like to see that study, because there are two studies that I noted, number 34 and number 35, in the
Yeah.
references document that I sent you, and both show that remote deliverer of immunocontraceptives can have those same benefits for managing overpopulation. Which, again, if we're managing overpopulation and we agree that like carrying capacity and the overpopulation of animals is essentially what leads to more spread of diseases like chronic wasting disease, et cetera, then we should be looking at more effective solutions, that we can more broadly administer than just a few select hunters that are going out and trying to manage. Now, I definitely I appreciate this discussion, and I think we've kind of come to, a good kind of ending point on the overpopulation issue. But now I want to get back onto ethics. So why
Yeah.
should we consider overpopulation of species like deer an issue to where we should go in with lethal force, right? So ethically, if most people are not willing to go out and hunt, right, most people consider that there might be alternative solutions to this overpopulation issue, right? Like some of the non-interventionist approaches that I've mentioned. If we have the options, right, to non-violently manage these populations and coexist with these populations rather than exploiting them through hunting and trapping, and fishing, why should we do that? Why should we not choose the ethical solution for this?
So, I would say number one is that when we're talking about the effectiveness, other ways that we can control it, I don't think that there is truly a better way to control it currently.
So
So
I've
that's
already
just, I know,
demonstrated,
I
I've
know.
already
But
demonstrated the problem
for
with that.
for the ethical argument,
Right?
if there was a better way to control it, then sign me up. I am a conservationist before I'm a hunter. I work in wildlife conservation. So
Cool.
that's what I care about is the healthy perpetuation of a population. But
Okay.
as a conservationist and as a hunter, what I also recognize is that death is natural and needed in an ecosystem. And currently, the rate of death that is exhibited through natural predation means is not high enough to meet the needs of the ecosystem. Hunters step in and they help to reach that rate of death in an ecosystem that is needed and natural.
We've already gone over this though on why hunting is not a valid solution, right? Like there are not enough hunters to do what you are advocating for, right? And like
So, well, so
if we actually look,
but the problem
so
is, but Ben, the problem with that argument is you're saying there's not enough hunters to do it, is that the goals are still met year in and year out by Fish and Wildlife. The goals that are set, they are. I can pull up the
no,
statistics
but
from Kentucky Fish and Wildlife.
that's what I was trying to explain to you, though, Ethan, is that hunting and the contributions from hunting through the Pittman-Robertson Act,
Mhm,
through licensing, and fees, through state DNR agencies, but also through a few other federal programs that fund state DNR programs. Those are going to land management practices that increase the carrying capacity, that help to increase these populations for the purposes of hunters, right? So that in and of itself is another contradiction, right? And that's why I think that
mhm,
hunting is not conservation, because hunting is an exploitative, consumptive act, right? That is a behavior. You're going into an ecosystem, you are unaliving an animal for your purposes, right? That is hunting. Conservation is the opposite of that. Conservation is what has protected us from not over exploiting these systems, right? So conservation is very much in conflict with hunting, because
mhm,
conservation is trying to protect and maintain and rehabilitate ecosystems, whereas hunting is literally the act of consuming, animals or quote unquote resources from these ecosystems, right? So that
mhm.
that is my whole argument, right? Like even just
So,
semantically or in the implementation
yeah.
of
So
hunting under the
my question would then be, talking about, maintenance through conservation. You don't think that hunting in and of itself offers a form of maintenance for wildlife conservation?
No, I think that typically hunting actually contributes to the very problems that you are trying to argue that hunting is a solution to. Because when we focus on game species through game management, right,
Hmm.
focusing on game species that hunters want to exploit, that is literally causing the overpopulation issues. And then hunters come in and say, oh, well, we've got an overpopulation, so we need this many tags this year, DNR, right? And the people at the DNR are very much focused on hunting interests. They're not focused on preserving biodiversity necessarily. Maybe it is an indirect thing of some of the programs, no doubt. And there are state level investments and trusts in various states that are focused on like refuges, which sometimes are exploited for hunting and trapping purposes.
Hmm.
But still, like hunting and what it contributes to is the perpetuation of hunting, right? Like it is very
Hmm.
much in contradiction to conservation efforts, right? And my entire argument for conservation is that, I get into arguments with other hunters that seem to want to focus on game management as if that is the entire focus of conservation, right? And they
Hmm.
don't want to focus on the land, the soil, the air, the ecosystems and biodiversity. And that is my whole argument, right? It's like hunting and the interest of hunting are focused on perpetuating hunting, perpetuating a consumptive behavior. Conservation is looking to regulate and reduce that, right? And protect these natural resources and wildlife. So that is why that hunting cannot be conservation, because it's literally the consumptive behavior that conservation is protecting from.
So, okay, that's a lot to unpack, but let's, take it like eating an elephant one bite at a time. So
I
for
won't
one,
even ask the elephant, but
So, for one, when we're talking about, the consumptive behavior of hunting and talking about how it can't be wildlife conservation because it perpetuates hunting, let's go back to carrying capacity. What I would say is the job of hunting is to maintain the carrying capacity. Now, this does not mean only overpopulation, but it also prevents underpopulation from occurring. So, the North American model of wildlife conservation was first implemented because through market hunting practices, we had extirpated the white-tailed deer, the
yeah,
wild turkey, the black bear from much of its native range.
right,
Through hunting practices and reintroductions, and the value being put on these game species through hunting, through organizations like the NDA and the NWTF, what we were able to do is from hunting through the Pittman-Robertson Act and also funding from private organizations that have no relation to hunting, we're able to reintroduce these animals into their native ranges that have been extirpated from market hunting. So that's great. That's step number one. But step
So
number
I do
two,
want to pause there though on step number one because you mentioned that it's like hunting practices helped when
yes.
I think you mean like hunting regulations, right? Like a limit, a regulation on hunting is what helped, right? Can you agree on that?
So regulations, yes, but also hunting practices. It's
So
both. So regulations.
what hunting practices besides like regulated hunting would contribute to the health of these
So
ecosystems?
from a conservation standpoint, that would be what we refer to as MIH, management intensive hunting. So that is something that I do is I go out into an ecosystem and remove older individuals from the ecosystem to create that vacuum for younger individuals to fill. And also by removing individuals that have completed their process in the ecosystem so they are no longer taking up the nutrients. Now, this
But
occurred in the state of
you
Kentucky.
But
Go
you're
ahead.
determining that. Like how can you come in and say, oh well, there's too many let's say I've seen you do some raccoon videos like in
Yeah.
various crop farms, right? And you come in and you say, well, I've been in contact with this farmer and he's just having, some pest issues from these raccoons, so let's trap them, right? And I think you
Yeah.
even stated in the video, you were like, it's overpopulated with raccoons. And like I'm sitting here like, wow, like did Ethan sit here and do like a whole like season, research on the number of raccoons, or is he just helping out his
So
buddy,
let's
with
talk
the
about
purpose?
that. So let's talk about that. So for my job, one of the things I have to do is coordinate a citizen science project. Now, for my citizen science project I did this year, I have all the data for it, was I checked the mesopredator population around Cave Run Lake in Rowan County, Kentucky. We did this through a series of camera traps, DNA samples, and also through trapping. And what we found is that there is a 40% overpopulation of mesopredators around Cave Run Lake. And this is directly impacting the wild turkey population, the ground nesting bird population, and specifically the bobbed white quail and whippoorwill population in that area. So I did my citizen science project with this and worked with 3 different sites around Cave Run Lake in the Daniel Boone National Forest to figure out the overpopulation issue. And actually, in this farm that you're talking about in this TikTok, I think I mentioned in the video it's right next to Cave Run Lake because the water is next to it. This is one of the areas I was trapping for this study for overpopulation of raccoons through Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah, so I would like to point out though that like mesopredators being increased and like quote unquote potentially overpopulated is a result of extirpation of apex predators, right? You would agree
Yes,
on that? Right. So
110% agree.
yeah, so if we're focused on ecology as a whole, the short-term solution that you're proposing is going out trapping, maybe relocating, but probably unaliving a good number of these
Mhm.
animals, right? Because you say that there's an overpopulation, but in effect, in reality, the issue is that there's an underpopulation on the trophic pyramid at the top, right? So
Yes, there is.
you're trying to address a short-term, solution when the longer-term solution is one, carrying capacity, and two, the predator to prey ratio, right?
So again, but the predator prey ratio, when we talk about this, same with Yellowstone. If we introduce and had a successful predator reintroduction in southeastern Kentucky of the black bear, which already has a stable population, of the black bear, of the red wolf, of the gray wolf, those were 3 big ones, and also the eastern mountain lion. But eastern mountain lion numbers have fluctuated naturally since the 1800s. So the big 3 were our red wolves, our gray wolves, and our black bears. If we had a successful predator reintroduction, we would still have a mesopredator overpopulation because of the increase in nutrients in the environment, for one. But two, and the biggie, talking from a scientific logical standpoint, is that because of human expansion, because of people living in these areas, if we reintroduced predators to these areas, they would probably be driven away because of human activities in the first place, and then the issue would perpetuate. And that's the problem we run into.
Yeah, but that's where, I would come back to the same argument I presented like 5 times, about overpopulation is that, there are situations like you mentioned in suburban and in urban areas where it doesn't make sense to reintroduce predators or to even really
Mm-hmm,
focus on trying to increase those issues. So again, it's
mm-hmm.
carrying capacity. It's how do we keep this wildlife, these mesopredators or even predators and potentially even herbivores that are affecting, landscaping, et cetera, as well as agriculture. How do we keep them out of those areas? And there are various
Yeah.
ways to do that without violence, right? So
But
one,
but
you have
but the
that.
problem, we circle back to this. The problem is, even if we introduce these predators now in rural areas, we go back to the Yellowstone argument. that is not fixing the overpopulation problem for our prey animals, for our herbivores, because Yellowstone is a perfectly enclosed ecosystem. Like that's what it's known for. They have recovered predator populations in that area, and yet we still have to hunt to manage that population. It's not an issue where there's one answer to the problem. It's an issue where there's multiple answers to the problem, and that can be hunting, that can be contraceptives in urban areas, that can be creating habitat, that can be keeping animals out of our gardens. But it has to be all of that for it to be effective. And that's what the North American model of wildlife conservation perpetuates, is that through hunting and through contraceptives and through all this and creating habitat is how we live and coexist with these animals.
So you can't really say coexist because you're literally like unaliving some animals,
Well,
right?
yeah,
Because
but I would
because of your
say I
benefit.
would say when I talk about wolves and bison in Yellowstone, they coexist together in an ecosystem. Wolves are
Right.
still unaliving bison, and bison are still unaliving wolves. I think coexistence can occur with death still happening between two species through
I
the
agree.
scientific definition.
I agree, but I think that, as I've demonstrated multiple times and as my sources, that I've shared with you demonstrate, that hunting has disruptive impacts on these ecosystems more so than benefit. And again, like I agree that, there are so many different solutions that we need to be looking into. Again, I've already outlined, why hunting isn't an adequate solution because of the population of hunters decreasing, as well as the scope, of that potential project. If hunting was like, we have to hunt to maintain these populations. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to do that with our current like budgeting and hunter population. So yeah, I agree that we need to have multiple approaches. But again, if hunting disrupts ecosystems, if a focus under the North American model is on game species at the detriment of the broader biodiversity, which we've seen, we have tons of evidence of, us overlooking like songbirds, and other parts like amphibians. There's a few examples in the sources that I sent you of that, and how the North American model has, with its focus on these game species for the benefit of hunters, has overlooked a lot of the biodiversity concerns, within the greater ecosystem. So I think,
Hmm.
if we can take the approach where we're focused on, habitat and carrying capacity and the health of these ecosystems, rather than, hey, how can we exploit these ecosystems and manage them in a way that people like yourself, and other hunters can continue to exploit them, I think we'd have a lot different, perspective on conservation, and especially if we bring the ethics into it and we consider these as individuals within inside of the ecosystem, not just as a resource, right? Like the North American model perpetuates this idea that wild
Yeah.
animals who have, conscious experience, subjective experience, are just resources. I think that is also a detriment to the ecosystems and to wildlife. In viewing them that way and not associating them as individuals that are part of a larger ecosystem. I think that's another detriment, of the North American model. And we've seen that alternative models like community-led and indigenous-led conservation efforts actually tend to promote biodiversity over exploitative, practices such as hunting. So we do have examples globally of, models of conservation that are better than the North American model because historically, like we've mentioned, in our review of conservation in North America, like hunting has literally been the issue, for these
Hmm.
ecosystems, right? And like it is the regulation, and intensive management of these ecosystems for hunters that has allowed us to get to the point where we're at. And we do
Yeah.
have correlations between the management practices for hunting through state DNR, as well as at a federal level, that increases these populations and causes the very overpopulation that we're talking about being an issue. So again, like I do not see any way that we can consider hunting as a valid part of conservation if conservation is about protecting and maintaining healthy ecosystems.
So again, same points that I've stated is that hunting, for one, a lot of the game species are keystone species, which ecosystems revolve around. So the perpetuation of those species is important. For two, hunting is about managing overpopulation and underpopulation. When we're talking about hunting, putting more of these animals on the landscape, I am all for that because hunting also manages that number. I want the carrying capacity to be met but not exceeded. Hunting ensures that the carrying capacity for that ecosystem is met, but not exceeded. And that's what's important. But
So
also,
can
when we're
I ask
talking
you,
about, go
I,
ahead.
I just want to ask you though, like, I think a lot of times when we're talking about conservation, like a point of contention is like this idea of like preservation versus intervention, right? And
Yeah.
hunters typically are on the intervention side because they see a potential like resource that they can extract from these ecosystems and try to do it sustainably, right, through conservation
Hmm.
and land management practices. Whereas
Hmm.
preservation is looking at the larger ecosystem and trying to maintain it, do rehabilitation, but in non-interventionist ways, right? So, if this is something I've asked Oblivion before, and some other hunters in discussion.
Yeah.
So, like, if let's say we're looking at Yellowstone, right, and we've done the wolf reintroduction. I'm not sure what's happening on my screen.
Oh, you're good.
But yeah, if we do like wolf reintroductions, in Yellowstone, and let's say ecologists and conservationists like analyze the populations, they were looking at elk, they were looking at the tree saplings,
Hmm.
rebounding after the wolves came in. They're looking at mesopredators. They're looking at the whole trophic system, and they come to this conclusion after, let's say, like 20 or 30 years, that all of a sudden, this ecosystem is perfect. We can agree that ecosystems have these ebbs and flows and populations of various species. That's healthy.
Yeah.
Nature is not static. Nature is a dynamic system. If we get a ecosystem to that point, right, where we notice healthy, regulations naturally through natural means, of natural ecological population control mechanisms like carrying capacity, predation, disease, all of these things. If we get that to a certain point, what is the point of hunting at that point? And would you, support saying, okay, we should stop hunting in these areas once we get them to healthy,
Yeah.
situation?
100%. If we get to a point where we have an enclosed ecosystem that like does not need human intervention, that's the goal of, national parks. That's the goal of having these spaces. That's the goal of that, of wildlife biology in those areas is
Cool.
to have that closed system. So
Well,
110%.
I really appreciate you saying that because I think a lot of hunters like have a dishonest answer when they say that, and they're really focused on like what they get from hunting, right? And I think
Yeah.
your big difference is that you really do try to focus on the altruistic, approaches. And as a conservationist, I think that's really important. But I think that brings us back to right the core ethics issue, right? And
Hmm.
how through hunting, if we're worried about overpopulation or the ecosystem at large as conservationists, not focusing on the individuals in those ecosystems is doing a disservice to those individuals and to the ecosystem at a larger scale. So my question to you would be, I know I've seen you do like catcalling,
Yeah,
debates and topics, which I think is obviously really controversial. And,
it
like even
is.
my topic, it's trying to get people, to have these discussions. And I can
100%.
appreciate that. But surely you understand that most people wouldn't support like encouraging people to go out and like hunt cats and dogs, right?
100% I do. But again,
Right.
I don't really care what's controversial. I know as
Yeah.
somebody that's worked in wildlife conservation and, looking at every statistic that we have from the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, that when it comes to, feral cats in general, they are probably the biggest threat to biodiversity that we have.
I mean, I can
So,
definitely agree with you, but I think that's where there's this like really big contradiction, right? In the way most people want to handle animals like cats and dogs, right? Like most
mhm.
people aren't going out and like I do know people who have hunted cats and dogs,
Yeah.
unfortunately, in my area, because they see them as a nuisance and they don't respect animals like that. But obviously, I care a lot, and I would much rather go and rescue some kittens, that are being
Mhm.
hunted and putting out poison or trying to trap them or things like that to take their lives away. So in a situation where you're either at a point, right, and let's say it's cats, because I know you're comfortable with discussing that topic. So cats, say in a local ecosystem, are having bad impact on biodiversity. They're taking out ground birds, they're taking out amphibians and snakes and reptiles, all of these
Yeah.
different things. We have the option to either hire a bunch of hunters and send them in, right, for thousands of dollars, let's say to hire them, for a week or two and go out and violently unalive these cats. The other option would be to say, hey, let's spend that thousands of dollars on animal control. Let's take these
Mhm.
cats in. Let's get them spayed and neutered if they have potential homes, so we don't
Mhm.
perpetuate the issue of overpopulation if they are outside cats, which I don't
Yeah.
encourage, anybody keeping their
No,
cats outside.
don't have outside cats.
Right, exactly. And so like, we have this second option, right? This option B where we work with animal control, we try to find them homes, because we care about these cats as individuals. We think that, their
Mhm.
life is valuable than just a pest that we should unalive. And we give them the opportunity, right? And if they don't find homes, and the animal control is severely underfunded, especially in my area, perhaps they're going to be euthanized, right? But that's going to be
Yeah.
medically done. It's going to be in a safe environment. They're not really going to suffer, right, through medication.
So,
So
so I
what
think
is the
I don't know,
argument?
Ben. I'm only interjecting just because I don't know how much of my stream that you've listened to about feral cats, but what you're saying is exactly what I talk about.
Cool.
Now the problem is the main difference is when it comes to feral cats and taking them in animal control and stuff, they do suffer from stress myopathy. So when it comes to a truly feral animal,
Yeah.
I am more in favor of euthanizing on site when a feral cat is captured, just because I know that there's 80 million. I know that shelters are, as someone that's volunteered at shelters, they're busting at the seams, and most of them are euthanized on site when you bring a feral cat to them.
Sure.
So I am in favor of euthanizing on site through
So
a
how
not.
would you do that? How would you do that?
So we would do it the same way that Australia and New Zealand do it. Australia does it one of two ways. They have a camera trap in the woods that shoots a poison dart into the cat, and the cat's dead within seconds. Which I am not I'm not in favor of here in the United States because pet cats, people have free roaming cats. I don't agree with it, but I don't want people's animals to be unalive. The way that I would do it is you're able to set a live trap on your property, capture the cat, call a game warden or your district trapper, so a trained professional comes out to your property, assesses the cat, checks for a microchip, checks for a collar, assesses health, assesses behavior. If they deem that cat to be feral, they can euthanize on site.
Okay. Well, I just think that's wrong. I think that's unethical. I think the domestic cat, feral issue is a human caused issue. And when
It is.
we react to human caused issues with more violence, and neglect, I think that's disrespectful to the individuals. I think even feral cats that are extremely traumatized from being outside can still live good lives in sanctuaries. We have tons of different animal sanctuaries that are specifically devoted to cats, feral cats, that could not go to normal homes. So there are
Mhm.
ethical options. And I think choosing the violent one when you can choose a non lethal one is very telling about like a person's kind of respect for an individual animal. And obviously, like
So,
I understand your position. And I'm not saying like you're
yeah.
unethical for that position. I'm just saying that I think most people are going to try to choose an ethical option for the situation of a cat. Right. So now
So
understanding this
Ben,
argument
so
around
Ben, I
cats.
agree with you, but I don't want to leave the cats yet just because I
Okay.
agree with you. But then I also look at countries like Australia, which tried to choose that ethical option and had no choice but to go with the options that I'm talking about because the ethical options do not work because of how fast they perpetuate as a species, because of the rehabitualization rates being so low for feral cats, and because the damages they're causing. When you're talking about not having respect for a species, I love cats. I have a cat that I rescued from the woods. He's,
Cool.
one of my best friends.
That's
But
awesome.
I respect our native fauna more than I respect our invasive fauna.
I agree, but
And
this is kind of
I
where,
know that I know it's a ticking time bomb of a problem because, I've worked directly in it. And currently the situation that we have put ourselves in and put cats in is that if we don't instigate a cull to create safe haven habitat zones for our native species, we're going to start seeing more and more species go extinct because of a human caused issue, and feral cats are the bullet to that metaphorical gun.
but see, this is kind of where I was trying to go, though. So, like, most people are willing to try to take an ethical option with an animal like a cat, right? Like, if there
Hmm.
is space for animal control, at the Humane Society, that's where most people are going to try to get that cat before they go and violently unalive it, right? And
Yeah.
I'm trying to make a comparison and, like show a parallel between most people's making a decision with cats, trying to make an ethical choice, right? But then arguing that something like a deer, right, or some animal that we value as a resource because what we can get from it, right, and put in our freezers, or hang on the wall or whatever reason somebody's hunting a deer for. There's a difference in our ethical treatment for these animals, and both in
Hmm.
these situations, right, the stray cats or feral cats, as you say, are wild. Technically, they are domestic
Yeah.
animals, but they've been wild. And deer are also wild animals. So why should we
Yeah.
treat deer differently in the overpopulation, from a conservationist perspective than we should with cats if there are ethical treatments such as,
From
sterilization or carrying capacity?
what I would say is, for one, we shouldn't. I think we should treat them the same. But for
Okay.
two, the only reason there should be a difference is because one is a native species and one is an invasive species. But the point that you're getting at from the ethical standpoint is, both lives are, valuable. And when it comes down to it, I think that they should both be treated the same. If I'm for, removal of deer through lethal means, then, my dog's laying right here. If my dog was feral in the woods causing damage to native species, then I would be for the lethal removal of domesticated dogs also, because
Yeah.
whatever's best for the environment.
Well, I appreciate that consistency, but I do think, a lot of times when we're discussing these topics, like it seems like hunters want to overlook the other potential, ethical options, right?
Hmm.
Like with dogs and cats, most people are aware that, there are other ethical options, right? But when we talk about, sterilization or carrying capacity or reintroducing predators, or all of these various means of controlling deer populations, most hunters seem to like kind of brush that away, right? And I appreciate
Yeah.
you engaging in, in engaging in these discussions, but
And
I
Ben, what
that
I
is
would
something
say,
we
what
need
I
to
would
look
say
at.
about that, Ben, is that most hunters brush that away. I agree, but when we're talking about everything you're talking about for cats and dogs, I recognize as a conservationist that contraceptives and sterilization doesn't work in feral cats and feral dogs either. And so if they don't work in those and Ben, I have statistics. The American Bird Conservancy has multiple peer-reviewed studies talking about the effectiveness of trap, neuter, release programs in feral cats. I think they have 7 peer-reviewed studies they've compiled through their feral cat census. It's extremely easy to find on their website. But we
I'll look
know
it
that
up.
trap, neuter, release programs. Please do look up American Bird Conservancy (TNR). You'll find their peer-reviewed studies talking about this. But we know that TNR does not work outside of highly urbanized areas. That is the only instance where we see TNR being effective.
Yeah, and that's actually something I wanted to mention too, is because like most of the stray cat and dog issues are in urban or suburban areas,
So
and once
that's
you
another
start getting
common. So
into
Ben, that's another common
one second,
misconception. Well, for the
one
sake of your
second, Ben,
argument,
let me
two
explain.
thirds
Let me
two thirds of
explain.
all
Let
feral
me finish
cats in the
my
United
argument.
States are in rural areas. Ben, 2/3
Uh,
are in rural areas.
I'm trying to address this, so like you cut me off halfway through, and that's a little
But
frustrating. So I
well,
would
when you say
appreciate you
Ben,
finishing
when you
what
say
you said.
something untrue, saying that most of them are within urban areas, I don't want you to perpetuate that because that's not true. We know from the feral cat census that the majority of feral cats are not in urban areas. There's 80
So
million feral
here's
cats,
the
and
thing.
55 million of them are in rural areas.
But obviously, rural areas in the United States are extremely more expensive than urban and suburban areas. Would you not agree?
They are agreed, but
So then
when you're
I
saying,
don't think it matters if 70 or 80% of the landmass of the United States is rural areas, and we're arguing that there's more feral cats, in rural areas.
well, yeah,
That's ridiculous. And you didn't even let me finish my point about the fact that there are population controls. Like here in my area, people leave their
mhm,
cats outside, right? And in the spring, you have all of these kittens born. I set up trail cameras near my neighborhood, right, where all of these feral
mhm,
cats are coming from. As soon as these kittens start wandering around outside of their kind of protected area, the coyotes show up, right? The fox show up, right? There are natural predators that are predating on these kittens. So in rural areas, we don't really
but
have
Ben,
the cat issue.
But Ben, in the rural area where I work at and do this, you would know that the feral cat issue is not controlled by the predators you're talking about. For one, a coyote does not want to go after a cat because a cat can fight back and a cat can go up a tree. It's not easy prey. It is not easy prey in a rural area for a coyote to get. And number two, the reproductive rate that feral cats have, even if we do have predation from coyotes and birds of prey, which are the two big ones for feral cats, that is not enough to control the feral cat population. And we have peer-reviewed studies backing this up. Please fact check me on that. Yeah,
No,
I implore you to.
definitely like that. I definitely would appreciate you sharing your sources. I mean, I
Yeah, I
would,
will. I promise. I will send all of those peer-reviewed sources right after this ends. But
yeah,
Ben,
perfect.
what I will say, because
And
I do have to, jump off. It's 10 minutes after 6, and I do have separate plans. But what I will say is, when it comes to the argument of domesticated species, just to end it off on that nail, is that when it comes to domesticated species like feral cats, I am all for unaliving them in an ecosystem, no matter what it is, if it benefits the ecosystem. And when it comes to wildlife conservation and feral cats specifically, feral cats are the most destructive mammalian invasive species worldwide. And
not true.
yes, it is a
What about
well,
humans, Ethan? What about humans?
well, per definition, humans are a migratory species, not an invasive one. But invasive
No,
species,
they can
well,
be considered. Humans can be considered invasive under
that can be your
ecological.
opinion, but per definition, humans are a migratory species. So when we're talking about invasive species being a human introduced species, feral cats are the most destructive human introduced species worldwide. I'll phrase it like that for you. When it comes down
But
to it,
humans
talking
are
about
considered unhuman.
the value of animal life, I value our native species more than I value an invasive species. And I think the big difference is that value for me versus your value. You value every specific animal's life. I do also, but I value native species more than invasive ones. But Ben, with that being said, I do have to jump off.
Yeah,
Uh, we will engage in another conversation soon. I will send you those
cool.
sources as soon as I get a chance for the American Bird Conservancy and the feral cat studies. But yeah,
Yeah,
good discussion. I think it was mutually beneficial, and I look forward to talking to you more.
yeah, I appreciate it, Ethan. I hope you have a good evening.